Good evening. I'm Dan Jarris from First Church Lombard. We are happy to have you with us tonight. We are going to start the program, and hopefully our middle speaker will get here and we'll hear what she has to say. We're here to learn some things, some perspectives about Israel and Palestine, which I think perhaps the three major faiths represented as a land of miracles. And in a way, it's a miracle that we were able to find a time and date to get folks together tonight. Coordinating calendars, coordinating the Sabbath, all kinds of different things. But we are here today, and yesterday was the UN International Day of Peace, and I see several faces that we saw at the little peace vigil that we had over at Glacier Park yesterday afternoon. Some people may have wondered, so what prompted this gathering? And I'm not sure there's one particular thing that prompted it. A couple years ago, First Church declared itself to be a just peace church. We've had a long, I think, history here of peace and social justice issues. I'm sure that for at least three of us on the committee that put this together, it was the fact that we have actually been to Israel and Palestine and have seen with our own eyes some things that were there, and certainly a variety of things from our own faith perspectives. And certainly the events of the past couple of years, and certainly in the last month or 6 weeks, some things that have been happening that perhaps made our gathering tonight even more appropriate. I would very much like to thank the sponsors of the evening that are listed on your program. And I would also like to thank the people who worked on the committee to have this all come together. And I would like to thank Tom Hammerschmidt, who's up in the balcony, who is allowing all of us to be heard tonight. That's pretty important. And in particular, I would like to thank Reverend Dan Sadler, who's seated over here, who did a huge amount of work in coordinating, making phone calls, emails, all that kind of stuff to bring this together. The presentation is being recorded, so I just wanted to let you know about that. And I'd start with perhaps another, it might be worth a caution that each of our speakers tonight is presenting their own perspective on the question. This is not, for example, the Holy Roman Catholic Church where the Pope speaks, on behalf of the whole church. These are individual perspectives, so I think we might keep that in mind. The format is that each of the speakers will be given 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and/or responses that they might want to give to things that they heard from others. And as your program indicates, the question we've asked them to think about is, what does peace with justice look like for Palestine and Israel from your faith perspective? And as an adjunct or a corollary, how might that peace with justice be achieved, if you have some thoughts about that? I'm not going to go over the backgrounds of our speakers. They are in your program. We have three Christian perspectives, a Jewish perspective and a Muslim perspective. So what we did was to put the panelists in order of a Christian, a Jewish perspective, a Christian perspective, a Muslim perspective, and then finally another Christian perspective. So without further ado, we are going to begin.
Thank you. When I was asked that question, what would peace with justice look like, I was tempted not to take this opportunity to speak, because I'm personally not hopeful that there can be a peace with justice in Israel and Palestine. But I'll say as much as I can. I don't want to start with negative point of view. 26 years ago, I was invited to be on an interfaith trip That was in 1992, 1 year before the Oslo Peace Accords. If you remember back then, things were pretty bad. So I was invited to be on this interfaith trip that went to the Middle East. We went to Egypt, visited with the president at that time. We went to Syria, we went to Jordan and Israel, and we met with Palestinian leaders as well. And I remember a general in Israel who said, well, we know what the solution is. We're going to keep the settlements around Jerusalem. We'll keep those, and then we'll give the rest of the West Bank and Gaza to the Palestinians for their future state. And the land that we take from them around Jerusalem, we'll give them a land bridge that will connect the West Bank and Gaza, and that will be the future state of Palestine. And if they misbehave, our tanks will roll down the streets and take care of the problem. So, a year later, we heard about the Oslo Peace Accords, and 2 years later, Rabin was assassinated in 1995. And that was the end of any possible peace process. It has gotten worse ever since. We have more settlements, we have harsher occupation, Gaza is a prison. So let me go back, not just 26 years ago, but 70 years ago. Because whatever happened back then, with the creation of the State of Israel and the elimination of the State of Palestine, affected my family directly. My family lived in Tiberias at the time, in 1948. They were asked to leave by their fellow Jewish residents of that city for their own safety. That was April 1948, right after the massacre that took place in Deir Yassin and other massacres. So people were afraid, the Palestinians were afraid. So they went only half an hour away by car to Eilabun, from which my last name comes, and stayed with my grandfather there for 6 months. Israel's independence was May 15, 1948. In October, the end of October 48, the Israeli army came and killed several people, including a cousin of mine, and pushed people to walk to Lebanon from there. So my family ended up in Lebanon. They were fortunate. 6 months later, they came back. There's only one Palestinian village, which is Eilabun, whose residents were allowed to come back. Somehow the priest that was there was able to contact international folks that came and saw the bodies of the people that were killed, and they intervened with the newly established State of Israel, and Israel allowed the residents of Eilabun to come back. There were 500 other villages that were emptied of their residents and completely destroyed. So my family came back, hoping to go back to Tiberias where they lived, but their homes were taken over already by settlers. They lost their businesses. They actually lost everything they had. So we ended up being, like many others, as internal refugees in Nazareth. So that's the story of so many Palestinians. It's not just Muslims, it's Muslims and Christians that were affected by what happened in 1948, in 1967, and to this day. So what's the solution? We believe as Christians that we're created in God's image. We meaning everybody. Jews, Muslims, Christians, and others in the world. We're created, that is, to love as God loves us, including our enemy. Now when we look at each other's eyes to see God in that other person, how do you do that when there's so much injustice? It's not easy. My church, the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, is committed to serve in response to God's love, to meet human needs. I'm just reading from a document here. They say advocating dignity and justice for all people, working for peace and reconciliation among nations. And because of that, we came up with a strategy in 2005 about Peace Not Walls strategy that would somehow engage all of us in my church, including bishops and people on the ground, to go there, travel there, find out what's happening, become better informed, and do advocacy work with our government so that peace with justice could happen. As you can see, none of that worked. But we don't give up. Our church, my church, is still committed to interfaith work. There's strong commitment to work with the Jewish community here as well as with the Muslim community, and that's been happening and relationships developing. But still none of that is making a difference. I want to just get to the bottom, I ask myself, what could be possibly peace with justice in that part of the world? First of all, I don't think it's possible. So whatever I'm going to say now is just really approximation of potential way of living together. As you know, any Jew anywhere in the world can immigrate to Israel and do what is called in Hebrew Aliyah, and they will be welcomed with open arms, but Palestinians cannot. I have relatives in Lebanon, my cousins. My uncle and aunt went there in 48, so my cousins are in Lebanon. I would love to come, at least and visit. I have cousins and relatives in Jordan, in Gaza, in Syria, and so do other Palestinians. And a lot of these folks I have not met. So the solution, I think, is to have a two-state solution where Palestine would be a viable, contiguous, independent Palestinian state next to a secure Israel. I say that, and something has to happen because right now there are settlements everywhere. But settlements can be eliminated, just like there were so many villages that were destroyed in 48 and in 67 as well. So it is necessary to go back to that kind of solution, two-state solution with an independent Palestinian state. It is necessary that there would be complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Palestinian areas. In fact, ending the occupation completely, with no presence of Israeli forces among Palestinians. Right now, Israeli army soldiers can go to any Palestinian territory, and they usually do it in the middle of the night and enter any house as they wish and take people to prison, including children. Another aspect of peace with justice is having shared Jerusalem. The present Lutheran bishop in Jerusalem once said, he lived in Jerusalem most of his life. He said, I can't imagine Jerusalem without the diversity of people that live in it now. Jews, Muslims, Christians, all kinds of denominations, so to speak, living together. If you've been there, you know how beautiful that is. I can't imagine Jerusalem not being shared. Shared Jerusalem. And then, just as importantly, equal human rights. Palestinians, I grew up in Israel, so I know what it's like not to have access to education, not to have access to good health. Actually, as I was growing up for 16 years, not to have the freedom to move freely without having to get a permit to go somewhere. So, equal human rights and religious freedom, so everybody should be able to worship in their places of worship without restrictions, access to educational, health, and economic opportunities for Palestinians. I prefer open borders, the separation wall coming down, And that's it.
I've been keeping time. 10 minutes and 10 seconds. Thank you. So we'll move to Rosa Williams. Thank you.
Shabbat shalom, y'all. So I'm going to start out by saying that in many ways I am a complete fraud. I am not a clergy person. I am probably the least well-educated person about this topic of any of the people at this table. But I have spent time in the Middle East. I went to the West Bank twice with an organization called Center for Jewish Nonviolence. And actually the mother of one of my friends from that trip is in the audience. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. But I think I have an unusual, well, and another reason that I think many people would say that I'm a fraud is because I belong to a synagogue that is openly and proudly non-Zionist, and that was an extremely intentional choice we made when we established the synagogue. I'm also part of an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace, which has been around since 1996. It sees itself as in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and it is generally considered anathema in what might be called the mainstream Jewish world. So it's actually kind of remarkable to me that this program chose to have someone like me represent the Jewish point of view, because there are many, many people in the Jewish mainstream community who would be absolutely horrified to learn that somebody from Jewish Voice for Peace was going to represent the Jewish point of view. But I think I have a unique viewpoint on this for several reasons. One is that I did not grow up Jewish. I grew up in a Protestant church community, not very different from this one in Chicago. And I only converted to Judaism when I was about 30, so I've been Jewish for about 20 years now. And I think being a convert definitely gives you some insights that maybe you don't have if you grow up in that tradition. So I think it's important to talk about why I wanted to be Jewish. And in addition to, I love glimpses, I love Seinfeld. But what really attracted me to Judaism, I'm a librarian, so being part of the people of the book was obviously a natural draw. But it was really the notion of ethics. And that what really, for me, distinguished Judaism was the ethical tradition, the idea that Judaism was not focused so much on the afterlife, but on doing right actions in this world. What's often referred to as tikkun olam, repairing the world. And that there's a very strong tradition of Jewish social action. Being African American, of course, the Jewish involvement with the civil rights movement was something that was very important to my parents, was very important to most of my Jewish friends and their parents. So this idea that a whole religion was really focused on how you work out social justice and ethics in this world was very important to me, and it's still very important to me. And I think that's really the reason that I'm still Jewish, and it's also the reason that I'm an advocate for Palestine, which may seem somewhat counterintuitive. But some of the things that I was reading when I was studying Judaism were concepts such as one that's called, is your blood redder? And the idea is that you do not have the right to endanger another innocent human being just to preserve your own life. You don't have the right to endanger another innocent human being to preserve your child's life. And there's an example from one of the rabbinic scriptures where a man has found out that his son has been kidnapped and is going to be killed. And if he pays a ransom, his son will be saved, but then another child will be taken and killed. And the rabbi says, then you need to pray for the soul of your son. So even if it's to save your own child's life, you cannot willingly endanger another human being. So when I look at some of what my colleague here has described about what's going on in Palestine, how does that in any way match that Jewish ethic of respecting all human life and saying that your blood is no redder than anyone else's? A Jewish Israeli's blood should not be considered any redder than a Palestinian Christian or a Palestinian Muslim's blood. And so it seemed to me that there was a profound disconnect and cognitive dissonance between the principles of ethics that I was studying when I converted to Judaism and what I was seeing happening in Israel and Palestine. And it was very difficult converting under those circumstances when I had a rabbi, who is not my current rabbi, who pretty much said that accepting Zionism was part and parcel of converting to Judaism, that I couldn't really fully convert if I didn't accept Zionism. But I've read a lot more about Zionism since then, and I think that's another important thing to understand. First of all, the notion of Zionism as a national state-building initiative is something that's actually fairly recent. And as you may know, Theodore Herzl was the one who started the modern Zionist movement. He was largely influenced by Christian millennial thinking. Even at that time, there was this idea that it was important to ingather the Jews to the Holy Land because that was what was going to eventually lead to the apocalypse. And several of the 19th century Christians who supported the idea of Zionism, partly it was because a lot of people in Europe, frankly, did not like Jews and would rather have them on another continent. But also there was this idea, this millenarian idea that we needed the Jews to be ingathered in order for the apocalypse to come. And also Balfour, of the Balfour Declaration, the British politician who established the idea of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. He was also a believer in this Christian millennial thinking. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize about how Zionism gathered so many supporters. But that was never the only form of Zionism. There was also cultural Zionism and spiritual Zionism. And much of what the rabbis had written about Jerusalem and Zion, in the Passover liturgy, we always say next year in Jerusalem, it wasn't really meant to be taken literally. It didn't mean that we were necessarily physically going to go to Jerusalem, physically going to go to Zion. It was the idea that at some point in the Messianic age, when the world was perfected, that would be when we would all be in Zion, when we would all be in Jerusalem. So it was never exclusively an idea that we would physically go there. The other thing is that it's certainly impossible to think of Israel as being a Jewish homeland and not an exclusively Jewish homeland. Now, we've just heard about the beauty of the multicultural nature of Jerusalem. For a very long time, Jerusalem and Palestine was a multicultural environment. There were people of many different ethnic backgrounds, many of whom could equally claim that that area is their homeland. So it was never really an exclusively Jewish homeland. And there were concepts of Zionism that suggested that Zionism would always be our cultural and our spiritual home, but it didn't necessarily mean that we all had to live there. And most importantly, it didn't mean that it had to be a political nation state that was going to exclude the rights of the other people in the region. And many of the earlier Zionists specifically said that they were concerned about making it into a political entity because it would risk the human rights of the people that were living in that area, which is, of course, what happened. The Jewish tradition that I ended up becoming a part of is something called Reconstructionism. And the leader of Reconstructionism, Mordecai Kaplan, he talked about Jewish peoplehood and Jewish civilization. And he was a Zionist, but he was really more of a cultural Zionist. And he is one of those leaders who specifically said that he was concerned about respecting the rights of the people who were living in what is now Israel. I also think that one of the cleverest things that the Zionists did was simply call the country Israel, because just by giving it that name, there's this whole series of associations that both Christians and Jews have with the name Israel, the idea of the children of Israel. But when we read in the Bible about God's promises to Israel and the children of Israel, it's really dangerous to conflate that idea of the spiritual peoplehood of Israel with the political nation state. And unfortunately, that is what has happened. And I'll talk plenty more about this later, but just to talk about what I see as a way forward. I am actually kind of hopeful, despite everything that's going on with Netanyahu, despite all the terrible things going on with the settlements and the home demolitions. I think the fact that the government of Israel has become so intensely right-wing, so intensely racist, so intensely Islamophobic, that it's making it much more difficult for progressive Jews in the United States to continue to say that they are Zionists and that are supporters of Israel. And I think the cognitive dissonance is getting more and more powerful. I'm not going to make any specific advice about the political situation except to say that it has to be done with the full agreement of the Palestinian people, the Palestinian civil society. It's not for us as Americans to decide what kind of state they should have. As long as, and that is actually the viewpoint of Jewish Voice for Peace, is that we don't support a particular political solution. We simply say it has to be done with the full involvement of Palestinians and Israelis and with a view to full and complete and equal human rights in that territory for both Palestinians and Israelis. But I think a key point is simply to think of Palestinians as human beings. And you know, that sounds so simple, and yet throughout my entire childhood, I mean, I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s, this symbol was something of terror to me. This meant Palestinian terrorists, this meant suicide bombers, this meant people who were not really people. And unfortunately, there is still a lot of that feeling in the United States as well as in Israel, that these are not actually people, that these are simply terrorists, simply people who want to drive us into the sea, simply people who are savage. And it really reminds me of what has happened in the United States with our attitude towards the indigenous people. The idea that there was a group of civilized people who came to a land without a people for a people without a land because they were being persecuted, they wanted to be free to follow their religion, and these indigenous people were simply savages who didn't matter, so we just got rid of them. And when we look at the violence of Palestinians, I think you have to look at it in context, in the same way that when we look at the violence of the indigenous people in North America, you can't divorce it from what happened at Wounded Knee and what happened on the Trail of Tears. And I think when we talk about violence, we have to look at the entire context of the violence, not just the violence of one side. And we also have to look at who has the most power. So I'm not saying that either side is pure or completely innocent, but it is very clear that one side has a lot more power than others. Palestinians in the past few years have been 15 times more likely to be killed in the conflict than Israelis. There is much, much, much more danger and violence perpetrated on a daily basis on Palestinians than what Israelis experience. So we have to acknowledge that Palestinians are human and should not be treated this way. And I think for the Jewish community, I think we need to look at more a Judaism of prophetic vision that is looking towards creating a messianic age by working towards human rights, by working towards justice. There's a phrase in the book of Zechariah about not by might, not by arms or might, but by my might. That in other words, we should not put our faith in empire and weapons and in our human might, but we should put it in the faith of God, and we should represent that faith by representing the values of Torah and human kindness and repairing the world, which are what brought me to Judaism in the first place.
Thank you. So we'll move to our center speaker, who last Israel again today.
Yes, it's on. I'm very flattered to be invited. I'm an Episcopalian, though brought up a Catholic. I have a tiny toe in the Middle East. My French grandmother was born in Aleppo in 1885. Her father was a French doctor in charge of public health there, laid the first modern sewers in one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world, which has now been blown up. She grew up in Alexandretta, now Iskandarun, and in Beirut, until her father retired to Constantinople, where she met and married my English grandfather. So how did I get engaged with Palestine? Only indirectly as a result of my work at the British consulate. At the turn of the century, there were anti-Muslim riots in some British cities, and the government realized that neither the police nor the press had any contacts in those communities. And I was charged with getting to know the Muslim communities in the Midwest, ranging from the Yemenis in Minnesota to the Arabs in Dearborn, Michigan. And I found myself on the PLO mailing list and learned of a Sabeel-led witness visit, my first in 2007. That got me hooked. I was back in 2011, 2012, 2014, 2016. And I met my first Palestinian and made friends when I was an undergraduate at Oxford in the early 1960s. Now, to address the issues we face today, the 25th anniversary of the Oslo Peace Accords, Alas, many young Palestinians who came of age after the Accords see the landmark agreements, which were supposed to lead to peace, as a betrayal of that, has only consolidated Israel's occupation. They see not only the expansion of the settlements, illegal under international law, but the frequent demolition, especially of Bedouin and other villages, which are considered a war crime under the Fourth Geneva Convention and condemned by the European Union Parliament, under which convention it also noted Israel bears full responsibility for providing the necessary services, including education, healthcare and welfare. Nevertheless, last week, Israeli military shut down all roads leading to the Bedouin village of Kar al-Hamar, following the Israeli Supreme Court giving the green light to demolish the village, expel its 180 residents, and make way for building a settlement. At Hebron, for example, there are now 6 illegal settlements, 95 physical obstacles, and 2,200 Israeli soldiers to protect 850 illegal settlers. Hebron is sacred to Jews, Muslims and Christians because of the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But it's also a prison to 215,000 boxed-in Palestinians. There are now nearly 700,000 settlers living in the West Bank. And there's now a new race law in Israel. I quote Gideon Levy in Haaretz from yesterday, September 21st. Quote, "As part of this madness, homes owned by Jews before 1948 are returned to their original owners through the Israeli legal system, dispossessing people who lived there for decades. At the same time, stolen or abandoned Palestinian property from 1948 has never been returned to its legal owners. In Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, in East Jerusalem, and in other places, Israeli flags multiply together with the hundreds of Palestinians left homeless after being kicked out of their homes in shame on the order of the egalitarian and just courts of the State of Israel." This week, a new record was set. In Jerusalem District Court, Judge Moshe Brody ruled that a Jew who was injured in a terrorist attack is entitled to additional compensation because he's a Jew, without proof of any damage based on the nation-state law, which states that the government will strive to protect the well-being of Jews. The circle has been closed, completed and perfected, and now it's a real race law, according to the unavoidable interpretation of the court of the nation-state law. From now on, 2 types of blood exist in Israel, Jewish blood and non-Jewish blood, on the law books as well. 70 years of nationalism and racism towards the victims is now receiving its appropriate legal backing. The nation-state law, which they said was only declarative, in the correct interpretation of Judge Drury, has earned its true meaning, the basic law for the superiority of Jewish blood. From now on, Israel has race law. And that's by a very distinguished Jewish journalist. This nation-state law declares Israel to be the nation-state of the Jewish people, establishes Hebrew as the official language, downgrading Arabic to, quote, special status, asserts that Jewish settlement is a national value and promises to advance settlement efforts. This new law will have far-reaching consequences for Palestinian citizens of Israel. By the way, there will be a conference on this in Chicago on October 5th. You can contact Jennifer Bing at the American Friends Service Committee. Israel killed 19 Palestinians and wounded 1,600 in August alone. The Times of Israel, yesterday, 21st of September, reports that on Friday, 1 Palestinian was killed and at least 312 were wounded, as some 10,000 Palestinians protested on the Gaza Strip on Friday, with some throwing explosive devices and rocks and burning tires, as soldiers responded with tear gas and occasional live fire. Since the protests began on March 30th, 2018, Israeli forces have killed at least 174 Palestinians in the besieged coastal enclave and wounded more than 18,000 people, according to health officials in Gaza. Reports have proliferated that Israel is in talks with Hamas via the UN and Egyptian mediation for a long-term truce in the Strip. Well, let's hope that's true and that it'll be successful. How does the situation affect the Christians, and especially the Episcopal Church in Israel-Palestine? Before the 1940s, about 20% of the population was Christian. Now it's less than 2%. As life became intolerable, those who had opportunities elsewhere left, though many in the diaspora retained close and active relations. Near Nablus, I met a surgeon and his wife who live in Michigan, but have built a wonderful house, vineyard and orchard, which all employ a lot of Nablus. The Episcopal and the Lutheran bishops are both Palestinian. A friend who works for UNRWA has often seen them both harassed at the airport. The Latin Patriarch has a particular dilemma, which the one I met explained to me. The holy sites are all looked after by Franciscan friars, most of them from other countries, and when they have to go home to Italy, Germany, France, because one of their parents is ill, he cannot afford to annoy the Israeli government, or they won't get their visas renewed. So the Latin Patriarch has to tiptoe extremely carefully. Meanwhile, here in the US, those of us who criticize Israel watch in horror as our president cuts off the US's significant and vital contribution to UNRWA, the final source of aid for Palestinian civilians, providing not just food and vital supplies, but the salaries of teachers, doctors, and other key public servants. That US contribution had already been budgeted by Congress. The US government will also cut an additional $25 million in direct aid to support hospitals in Jerusalem. The impact on the Ali Hospital and the Princess Basma Center will be profound, affecting electricity supply as well as medical supplies and medicine. The Ali Hospital services yearly 33,000 poor, marginalized and vulnerable patients. The Princess Basma Center for Disabled Children in East Jerusalem provides therapy and rehabilitation and trains mothers in caring for their children's disabilities to families throughout Jerusalem and the West Bank. If you want more information, you contact the American Friends of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. To demand that Palestinians living under military rule negotiate with their occupier and oppressor is akin to demanding that a hostage negotiate with their hostage taker. It's repugnant that the world demands that Palestinians negotiate their freedom, while Israel continues to steal Palestinian land. Instead, Israel should face sanctions for continuing to deny Palestinians their freedom while illegal settlement building continues. BDS is one effective way to show support. Hanan Ashrawi from PLO urges the international community to appeal to the International Criminal Court to take immediate action and open official and criminal investigations into Israel's egregious violations. She concludes the real solution remains ending the occupation and enabling the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination in a free and sovereign state on their own land, with Jerusalem as its capital. Please understand that I'm not anti-Israeli. I oppose the present situation. And if you're concerned about the future of the state of Israel, there must be a just accommodation with the Palestinians. To get there, the Palestinians need to get rid of their aging and interfighting leadership, Hamas v. PLO. Rashid Khalidi, whose forefathers arrived in Jerusalem in 632 with Caliph Omar and still have a house in Jerusalem. Rashid is a professor at Columbia now, I think he will say professor. Rashid is optimistic, seeing an emerging young leadership both in Palestine and on US college campuses. But the US political leadership, Trump and co, does not support a two-state and increases problems by moving the US embassy to Jerusalem. He also denies the very existence of refugees, saying that there are very few left from 1948. The Great March of Return is a popular wave of optimism and resilience, emphasizing non-violence and focusing the world's attention on Gaza while reinvigorating the West Bank. Inside Israel, some now comprehend the outcome of the new law. It has created an apartheid regime, turning away from Israel's foundational principles. In the Arab world, 75% of the population in 12 Arab countries support the Palestinians. Thank Trump and Bibi for abandoning the pretense of supporting Palestine. US support for Israel is now wholly Republican, old white men. Israel is increasingly seen as a strategic burden on the US. Complete equality of rights and duties are necessary for a true and lasting solution. We in Illinois need to support Senator Durbin and Jan Schakowsky when they speak up. We now have a Palestinian in Congress, Rashid Tlaib of Michigan, and a Somali Muslim, Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. Next week, on September 26th, Abbas will meet many Middle East envoys and heads of UN committees that deal with Palestinian issues at the UN, and he'll meet Trump. Let's hope something comes of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting us. It is commonly stated that the conflict is somewhat religious, and there is something in the religion of Islam and Muslim attitudes which makes this conflict more intractable. As a Muslim in the panel, I want to describe this matter. The fact of the matter is that Muslims and Jews have a very long history of coexistence. For a long time, Islam was not only a religion, but it was a political entity. A very powerful caliphate existed for almost 1200 years. And many religious communities were part of this caliphate. And from modern secular standards of civil equality, there were certainly discriminations, that everybody was not equal, but yet minorities did have certain rights under the Islamic law. The idea of Judeo-Christian tradition is relatively new, but in fact we do have a very long tradition of Islamic Judeo understanding and interaction. Our famous Jewish scholar Bernard Lewis, in his book The Jews of Islam, has amply demonstrated that while there are low points, but for more than 90% of the time, the communities coexisted with in relative ease. And there has been a lot of intellectual cross-fertilization in many heartlands of Muslim culture. He stated a very interesting story about Maimonides. Maimonides, when he was a young boy, he converted to Islam. And later on, he realized his mistake and went back to Judaism. In later years, when he was in the court of Caliph in Cairo, one of his enemies sued him in the Sharia code under the law of apostasy. And Maimonides came to the court well equipped with Sharia and Quran and defended himself on the ground of Islam's belief in freedom of religion and he says that Islam gives him right to choose whatever religion he wants to do. And in fact, he was successfully released and maintained his position in the court. Here at American Islamic College will hold a program on October 9 by Dr. James Robinson, a scholar at the University of Chicago, which is titled, How Much Islam is in Medieval Jewish Thought. And I think you can easily reverse that and say, how much Judaism is there in Islamic thought? And in fact, as a student of Islam and Sharia, I know that there is a lot of Jewish thought in Islam, and in fact, halakha has been an important source in development of Sharia. Now, the idea that can Jews and Muslims live together, I would say yes, there is enough history that we live together, and in fact, there is enough history now right here in the United States that we and Jews are living together. A few years back, when I was in Northbrook, and there is a very beautiful mosque on Kingston Road, Islamic Cultural Center. Some of you might have visited it. And there was a Jewish synagogue, which is now built, but at that time they were in the process of constructing their synagogue. And they were looking for a space which they would use temporarily when their synagogue is under construction. And they realized that Muslims are the only one who do not use their facility on Saturdays. And we are the one who need it on Saturdays. So they came to Northbrook Mosque and they told them their problem, that they need a place for Saturdays. And the mosque said, you are most welcome, there is no problem. And they said, okay, but who will open the building for us? And he said, there is the key. And just take this key, when you come Saturday, open it, and make sure when you leave it's closed. So they were shocked at the degree of trust which this community, which is almost half Arab and half Bosnian, placed in them. And in fact, this is the way they used this mosque for a long time until their synagogue was built. And the relationship between this synagogue, which is Aish, A-Y-S-H, and Rabbi Sherbel, and the mosque and their imams, it was wonderful. And for a long time, they had many interfaith events which we continued. In fact, later on, there was one time when the city wanted to shut down the school which was in the mosque on the ground that the building is not zoned for a school activity. And this synagogue came and they said, they went to the village and they said, we will move the school in our synagogue if you try to shut it. So, here we have enough to see that how the relationship between two communities can be excellent relationship, better than we expect and desire. However, it is possible only when people are free and they are independent and they are on equal footing. And that is what makes the real difference. The problem with Israel is that it is essentially a settler colonial project which required dispossession of the local population. The genesis of this project was in Europe. It was not in the Middle East. And in fact, the Middle East at that time had as many Jews as there were in Europe. But it is noteworthy that these Jews did not claim and did not want to state of Israel. They did not try for it at all. And in fact, they did not want to migrate there. Their migration came later, gradually, when these societies started to suffer from disintegration and conflicts and civil wars. And in fact, many Jews, the last segment of Jews from Iraq moved when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. Now, we assume that there is a conflict and there are two parties of conflict, but as my respective colleagues mentioned, that it is really one party, and which has all the cards in their hand. We have a joke in our language that a teacher asks a student, elementary student, that what will you do if you are passing through woods and suddenly a lion appears? And the kid says, it's up to the lion, what can I decide? So here the power rests in the hand of Israel and the people who support Israel. And therefore, it is really that a solution to the problem has to come from within Israel and from within American society and community which supports them unconditionally. I have made many trips to Israel, Palestine in the past 6-7 years. And we were in Bethlehem University a year ago. And we were talking to the youth there. And I was asking them what you can do to meet your Jewish partners, and a kind of relationships can be built in a younger and future generation, which they said first it's not possible because we cannot cross the wall and we cannot cross the checkpoint, and in fact if we are seen in a Jewish area we will be arrested. And what they said is that the problem at this time is that it is our existence which is angering Israel, not what we do. They're just getting angrier and angrier that why these people are not leaving, because they want this land. They want to see this land without us, and that is the root cause of the problem. Now, what has been happening here is that during all these years, we had this charade of two-state solution, which I don't know who is serious for that and how far it is viable. In fact, AIPAC has wisely removed it from its website. And if you have visited the land, one thing you cannot miss is that now Israel is virtually in control of 90% of the Palestine. And the settlements which they have built very deep in Palestinian territories make virtually impossible any two states. Two states, first of all, a state requires a lot of infrastructure. When you have a state, the state needs highways, the state needs railways, it needs airport, it needs electricity towers, it needs communication poles. And there, the real situation is that this church is Israel and the library is Palestine. And it's virtually impossible to have for a Palestinian state a viable infrastructure of a state in present situation when their communities are divided, scattered, and walled, and they are not connected with each other. And for each and everything, they are dependent on Israeli power and Israeli authority. I've been to Al-Aqsa Mosque many times as a Muslim. Whenever I go and pray there. And I see that there are water taps for ablution which are broken. And you will see that they are broken for 6 months to 1 year and nobody fixes them. When you ask, they tell you that Israeli authorities do not allow them to bring the new water taps in the mosque. Because of that slippery marble rock which they have used outside the mosque, and which in the rain becomes very slippery, they started to chisel the steps so people shouldn't fall, and it has some grip. And immediately Israel came and it stopped it. They said you cannot have any changes in the structure which is there. So here the fact of the matter is that the power rests in the hand of Israel, and there is virtually no power and authority left with Palestinians except just to collect garbage in some limited areas which is technically called the Area A. Personally, I feel that any solution to the problem will come only if we get out of this colonial framework of discourse. And we have before us a decolonized horizon in which we treat all people equally. Something similar to South Africa.
We're going to need to
Of course, it's not exact parallel, but something similar to that, that eventually the realization came that we cannot create shanty towns for this community and that community, but we have to accept that we are all here together and we will face one society for all. And that will come, I think, that Israel, by building these settlements in deep Palestinian territories, may itself be helping and facilitating this future. Okay. Jeff Helper of Israeli Committee Against Demolition, he says BDS is very important, and he says what I mean by that is binational democratic state. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. First, I would like to thank Dan and Jan and this congregation, First Church of Lombard, for organizing this panel. In a time when every topic seems to be polarizing, those of us who are engaged in Israel-Palestine have some experience dealing with a contentious issue. To be able to have an honest and thoughtful discussion on an issue of such global concern in a forum like this is valuable. I would also like to express appreciation and acknowledgement of my co-panelists and to say how pleased I am to be a part of it with you. September 2018 marks 40 years since the Camp David Accords were signed and 25 years since the Oslo Accords. Both offered the hope of peace, but neither agreement led to real peace or justice for the Palestinians. In the meantime, settlements have expanded, the separation barriers construction began, refugees remain in exile. We are no closer to peace. Today, the Palestinians continue to lose ground, literally and figuratively, but at a seemingly much quicker pace. In the West Bank, just 3 weeks ago, Israel approved 2,000 new settlement units. Since President Trump took office, nearly 10,000 new units have been planned or approved. Contrary to previous practice, this administration has not expressed concern or condemnation. In order to expand settlements, Israel has to appropriate more land. Its High Court recently upheld a decision to allow the demolition of Khan al-Ahmar, the Palestinian Bedouin community at the West Bank, for settlement expansion and for the possibility of annexation of land areas designated by Oslo for long-term transfer to the Palestinians. The United Church of Christ and Christian Church Disciples of Christ, with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, sent a letter to all congressional offices 2 weeks ago requesting that Congress uphold the principles of international law, support U.S. policy of opposing settlement expansion and the demolition of communities, and do what is right, communicating that message to pressure Israel to refrain from leveling Khan al-Ahmar. Since Oslo was signed in 1993, more than 15,000 Palestinian homes have been destroyed. When Donald Trump announced in December 2017 that he would not sign the national security waiver, effectively beginning the process of moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he overturned decades of U.S. policy and practice, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and upending international consensus on the status of East Jerusalem as occupied territory. Ironically, as U.S. and Israeli officials celebrated the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem in May, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the establishment of Israel, Israeli soldiers were taking aim at Palestinians in Gaza who were protesting to assert the great right of return, 70 years after the Nakba catastrophe, when 750,000 Palestinians became refugees or were displaced and dispossessed. Within the confines of Gaza, Palestinians don't enjoy liberty or rights due to a system of control that Israel keeps in place, of land and of sea. If settlements, home and community demolitions, and systems of constraint force Palestinians to lose actual ground, they are also losing ground on key issues because of funding cuts, policy implications, and the destruction of systems. Before leaving office, even as the U.S. abstained from and didn't veto a UN Security Council resolution on settlements, President Obama negotiated a new 10-year, $38 billion military aid package to Israel, which takes effect in the fiscal year 2019, which actually begins next week on October 1st. More recently, President Trump cut U.S. funding for the UN Relief and Works Agency, as you've heard already, by more than half in January, and announced that it would eliminate U.S. funding for UNRWA at the end of August. In addition to providing education and health care for more than 5 million Palestinian refugees, UNRWA also is a major employee of refugees who are often not permitted to work in similar skilled positions outside of refugee camps. The administration further cut non-security-related funding to Palestinian peace building and health initiatives, including El Ahly Hospital and Augusta Victoria Hospital. Both Illinois Senators, Duckworth and Durbin, have urged the president to reinstate that funding. In the U.S., the Palestinian mission in Washington, D.C. was forced closed last week, and the Palestinian representative and his family have had their visas revoked. The funding cuts and the closures were, according to the administration, punitive measures against the Palestinians for not taking steps toward negotiations. And beyond that, these steps undermine international systems, institutions, laws, and norms impacting human beings very directly and adversely. This at a time when the administration continues to delay its, quote, deal of the century proposal for peace in the Middle East, on which the administration has not attempted to meet with Palestinian leaders while working closely with Israel. Further, Congress and 37 state legislatures either have passed or are considering laws that would criminalize support for aspects of boycott, divestment, or sanctions as they relate to Israel or the occupation. Illinois was the first state to enact such a law in its state legislature. The irony of these funding cuts and policy shifts is that they explicitly sanction the Palestinians, even as the congressional and state legislation make it legal the use of economic measures to oppose Israeli violations of international laws. Many U.S. churches, whether they have a position on BDS or not, have responded by asserting our right to use economic means to promote justice in this case, as we have in many cases in the U.S. and around the world. In light of that context, what will make for peace, and what can we do as members of churches and faith communities here in the U.S. to promote that peace, especially as we recognize that the possibility of a two-state solution is either passing or has already passed? What does our faith ask of us? In the words of Micah, the Lord requires us to seek justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. And Jesus taught us to love God and love our neighbor. In the case of the UCC, we have drawn on our long history of mission engagement and partnerships in the region to guide us. Through our relationships with our neighbors there and our characteristic concern for peace and justice, we know that it is essential to go beyond the headlines and rely on the authentic voices of our partners who are living the reality on the ground every day. While those partners are predominantly Christian churches and agencies, including the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land, and the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, and the Middle East Council of Churches, we also have access to and relationships with Palestinian Muslims and with Israeli Jews. Through humble listening, those ties help inform our understanding of the reality on the ground for our engagement, our church policy, and our advocacy. When groups from our churches make a Holy Land visit, we encourage them to heed the call of Palestinian Christians to visit the people there, and not just walk through biblical and historical sites. Our faith calls us to seek relationships, to be kind, and to receive the kindness of those who would want to know us. Even when we cannot visit, we support Palestinians through partnerships, which allows us a way to have a connection with our partners and to learn about their important work and the context in which they carry it out. Through the church and through global ministries, our partners help to provide access to a different perspective than what is more commonly available, putting a human face on a rather complex and distant issue, bringing it closer to home. Equipped with this access, we can seek justice by repeating the story and the truth in our churches and our communities, and by joining in advocacy with our elected officials, either by going to Washington, meeting in their district offices, or calling or sending email messages expressing our views. Representatives often say that they don't hear our voices as much as they hear other voices. While it is true that it is the Israelis and the Palestinians who must ultimately negotiate and reach agreement, the U.S. wields significant influence and is not a neutral partner, primarily due to its decades-long support of Israel's positions and the high level of military aid that we send to Israel each year. So we do have a stake in this, and it is in the U.S. interest to promote a peaceful and just resolution to the conflict that would benefit Palestinians and Israelis alike. We have called for the U.S. to take actions that will enhance the prospects for peace, justice, and equality, and regularly urge our members to engage our elected officials with advocacy action alerts on Gaza, on the rights of children living under Israeli military occupation, on Jerusalem, on U.S. military aid to Israel, U.S. funding to UNRWA, to pressure Israel to end home demolitions, to end the occupation, and other aspects of the daily manifestation of the conflict. For us in the UCC, we reject the framing of the conflict primarily as a religious conflict. It is too facile to fall into the trap of thinking of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as one between Muslims and Jews. Those who frame it that way seek to give it the character of an eternal conflict that cannot be resolved because of theological positions that cannot be reconciled. It is inaccurate as well because that narrative removes the Palestinian Christian community, which, while small, is present and has contributed significantly to Palestinian life and society, and who have suffered the effects of occupation as well. It is more helpful and accurate to understand the conflict as one over land, resources, borders, and rights, in which religion plays an undeniable role, but is not the central issue. As religious communities and as people of faith, we do have a responsibility to be a moral voice, naming injustice when we see it. The voice of Palestinian Christians is a powerful one. Let me close with the final few lines of the Kairos Palestine document, which was issued in 2009 by members of the Palestinian Christian community. Quote, "The mission of the church is to proclaim the kingdom of God, a kingdom of justice, peace, and dignity. Our vocation as a living church is to bear witness to the goodness of God and the dignity of human beings. In the absence of all hope, we cry out our cry of hope. We believe in God, good and just. We believe that God's goodness will finally triumph over the evil of hate and of death that still persist in our land, and that we will see here a new land and a new human being capable of rising up in the Spirit to love each one of his or her brothers or sisters." Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, but we are going to allow a few questions, but I'm going to plant a seed with our panel, and they can choose if they want to have the seed grow. I'm a big believer in the notion of asking the right questions. In fact, a few times when I was in the classroom, I used a little book called Asking the Right Questions as a text. So our last thing this evening, I'm going to ask, if you choose, what would be the right question that any of us could ask? But Dan has a microphone, so if you have a question for the whole panel or individuals, Dan will bring you the microphone.
Hello, I'm Ruth Nelson. I have been to Israel, Palestine twice, 2 weeks a year ago. I spent on the West Bank. It seems very apparent to me that the chances for a two-state solution are slim and none. And it seems by continuing to perpetuate the talk of a two-state solution, that we're walking into the hands of those that want to continue the occupation. Please comment.
I mean, personally, this is exactly what my observation is. That on various grounds, political, economic, material, infrastructure, I really don't think that two-state solution is viable from any point of view. And discussion around it simply prolongs the conflict. It's really time to get out of that mold and think what are the other possibilities. And that would require to have a decolonized horizon, where we are not focused on how to protect one community, how to preserve its power, how to maintain their high status, rather how we can have a genuine equality.
And I would add to that, I like to think of this more as a question of individual human rights as opposed to group rights. A lot of the Palestinians I know, it's not so much that they care about what state they're in, they want to go back to their home. You know, they're people that still have the keys to their homes from 70 years ago. And, you know, I would agree that the whole of a two-state solution is maybe kind of a mirage. But I think the focus needs to be on individual human rights, not so much on group rights. And I think that's one trap that we kind of fall into with the two-state solution.
Many of our churches still do have, as official policy, support for a two-state solution. At the same time, we're engaging that debate. And just last year, a number of churches and Christian organizations wrote a statement called "Toward Peace, Justice, and Equality in Israel-Palestine," and recognized that this debate may be past, and essentially affirmed what you just shared, that regardless of the underlying political governance structures, equal rights and opportunities must be assured for all people in the region, not someday based on an idea of future negotiations, but as a fundamental human right today. So indeed, the churches who still support a two-state solution are engaging that debate and recognizing the reality as it's changed.
To achieve equal rights will require overthrowing this new nation-state law that Israel has just instituted. Completely overthrowing it. And I think it's very important to realize that the Israel of today is the total opposite of the Israel that was founded in 1948. It was a secular, socialist, communitarian state. It is now the exact opposite of all those. And one of the tragedies is that 1 million liberal Israelis have left permanently. 1 million liberal Israelis. When I started going to Palestine, all the alumni of my Oxford College, there were about 10, I met them all, we had a great time. They were all left, permanently gone. And the bizarre thing is, there are now 30 to 40,000 Israelis living in Berlin, right? They went back to the country that tried to destroy them. Amazing, isn't it?
And the pressure which Israeli human rights group are facing, it has increased enormously, that they are not allowed to work openly and, you know, in fact their lives are physically in danger, that they are afraid to go out and openly take liberal positions.
I think also we haven't talked about the right of return. And JVP supports the right of return unequivocally. The United Nations supports the right of return. Refugees have the right to return. And of course, what you'll hear from a lot of Israelis and Zionists is that this would destroy the Jewish character of the state. But once again, I'm more interested in the individual human rights of those 750,000 people and the 7 million now Palestinian refugees, many of whom are still in refugee camps and are stateless. And any true conception of peace and justice has to address the Palestinian refugee question and the right of return.
Do we have one other question? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I said nothing. I can't add anything to that. It's beautiful.
One more question. Try to be respectful of time here.
This may be a very naive question, but if the goal is mutual respect and peaceful and just coexistence, what I seriously would like to know is that are there mainstream people on both sides who have the strength and the courage and who are truly seeking ways of non-violent achievement? The 70 years, we've seen so much violence, and I'm not here to blame one side or the other. I just want to know where are the mainstream people doing some self-reflection on both sides and truly seeking to sit down and find a way to live, to coexist.
So that is a great question, but I think there are a few things with that framing which I find problematic. One is that I think a lot of us at this table get really frustrated with the both sides framing as though they're two equal sides. There are not two equal sides. There is one population that has been oppressed, that was deprived of their homes, that is still suffering violence at a far greater rate than the other side. So that is absolutely important to remember. The other thing is, it always really makes me laugh when people ask about where are the Palestinian partners for peace. Somebody mentioned the idea that our existence is the problem. And when you see Palestinians who have had their homes destroyed 5 or 10 times over, and they keep coming back, and they keep replanting that Za'atar field, and they keep replanting that olive grove, and they keep rebuilding that house. That is peaceful, nonviolent resistance. There are many groups that most people in the U.S. don't seem to know about. We worked with Youth Against Settlements, a fantastic leader named Issa Amro, who's known as the Palestinian Gandhi. But there are actually 4 or 5 other leaders in Palestine today who are known as Palestinian Gandhis. And you just don't see as much about them in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. The other thing is that, so yes, the continued resistance is part of the nonviolent work, but the other nonviolent thing that all of you can support is something that's already been mentioned, which is the boycott, divest, sanctions movement. And I think anyone in Israel or the United States who truly cares about a just peace would be supporting the BDS movement. And that is something that came from the Palestinian civil society. Several different organizations within the Palestinian society called for the boycott, divest, sanctions movement. And that is one serious way to show nonviolent support for that. In terms of the other side, in terms of Jews and in terms of Israelis, there are a lot of Israeli peace groups that are working on exactly what you're talking about. And in terms of American Jews, yes, people like Jewish Voice for Peace is seen as an outlier, but there's If Not Now, and there's J Street, and there's Yaakad, and there's Judas, and there's the Arab Jewish Partnership for Peace, and these are the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Group. There are a lot of Jewish groups that are working against the occupation and working for a complete, fair, and just peace. Now, I think the problem is that the mainstream of the Jewish American world, which is increasingly old and frankly I would say out of touch with young Jews, is very resentful and does a lot of resistance against these young voices. I mentioned that the mother of one of my friends, Hannah, who I met on the CJB trip, is here. Hannah and I met up a few months ago at one of the protests over the killings in Gaza, and there was a press photographer who wanted to take a picture of us, and she said that she couldn't be photographed because she's studying to be a rabbi, and she would not be able to get a job in any synagogue if her picture turned up at a pro-Palestine protest. That's an attitude in the American Jewish community that has to change. There has to be a recognition that many, many young Jews are in fact troubled by this and are in fact willing to work with Palestinians and with Muslim organizations to stop the occupation and to stop the abuse of Palestinians. But I would also say, since this is a primarily Christian audience, there is a lot that Christians can do. And one of them is to not be afraid of the word anti-Semitism. Because one of the things that the Israeli government is doing and that very strongly Zionist organizations here are doing is trying to make any type of support for Palestinians tantamount to anti-Semitism. And that is just absolutely ridiculous. There is legislation called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that would basically say that anyone standing up for Palestinian rights, anybody arguing for the delegitimization of Israel is anti-Semitic. And this is having a profound effect on college campuses. Recently, even though the law hasn't been passed yet, Kenneth Marcus in the Trump cabinet somehow managed to slide in this little executive order that says, in effect, that criticizing Israel is tantamount to anti-Semitism, and that student groups can be sanctioned for addressing Palestine because that is supposed to be anti-Semitic. And obviously the Christian churches have a very long and painful relationship with anti-Semitism, but we should not trade one form of oppression for another. So yes, the Christian church contributed to anti-Semitism in the past, but that doesn't mean that you should be contributing to the oppression of Palestinians now. All of you should be calling your congresspeople and telling them to oppose the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. All of you should be opposing the BDS legislation. And not just in Illinois, but across the country. Something, I think like 27 states have either passed or are planning to pass anti-BDS legislation. So the short answer is, yeah, there are a lot of people on many sides working on these issues. But I think we all have to take responsibility for prosecuting human rights in Israel for all people, and to recognize that there is this huge disproportionate power vacuum on the part of the Palestinians as opposed to the Israelis. And simply saying that we're praying for both sides or asking both sides to get along is not the solution.
So I'm looking at the clock here. So we're going to have a chance to continue conversations informally. Do any of you have a right question you would like to share? It's okay if you don't.
I think my question would be also an encouragement, and that is, how does our effort to work for peace and justice and oppose injustice and oppression in Israel-Palestine connect with the efforts we're making to oppose oppression in other contexts as well, including our own here in the United States? These are systems. These are bigger and connected phenomena. So the question we can ask is, how does our participation in Israel-Palestine or in Black Lives Matter or any similar kind of struggle, how do these connect? And how do they work toward the same ultimate goal?
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like us to thank our panel.
We were asked to sort of provide some concrete solutions. I have a handout out at the front that lists some of my concrete solutions, but one really quick thing you can do, in addition to the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act and the BDS legislation, there's something called HR 4391, which would require the federal government to keep track of how much money goes to the detention and imprisonment of Palestinian teenagers. And if you think of any teenage boy you know with maybe not great judgment, your son, your idiot nephew, who goes out and does something like throwing rocks, and then imagine him being awakened in the middle of the night by armed soldiers, dragged out of your house with a bag put over his head, handcuffed and thrown into the bottom of a Jeep overnight in the cold, and then sent away to a prison where you can't visit him for 3 or 4 months. This happens on a daily basis to Palestinian teenagers in the West Bank. And this is the first legislation introduced in Congress about Palestinian human rights, and it's absolutely vital that people stand up and support it. So there are cards in the narthex that tell you about it. I also have cards here that you can fill out and leave with me, and Jewish Voice for Peace will send these in to whoever your congressional representative is. Thanks.
Salam, shalom, peace.